And I think by now we are live. So welcome back to No Name Podcast International. In this series, we talk to cybersecurity experts all over the world to discuss cyber domain of the war, make new connections for Ukrainian InfoSec community, and learn from our colleagues abroad. And today we speak with Liisa Past, National Cyber Director of Estonia. Liisa focuses on protecting the infrastructure of democracy in the digital world and securing our increasingly electronic way of life. She also held positions of CISO of the IT and Development Center at the Estonian Ministry of the Interior, served as the Chief National Cybersecurity Risk Officer for the National Estonian Government for the Estonian Government Office, and Chief Research Officer at the Cybersecurity Branch of the Estonian Information System Authority. Liisa also spent 2 years as a next-generation leader at the McCain Institute for International Leadership at Arizona State University, focusing on cybersecurity of the technologies underlying democracies and elections. She's widely published and often speaks on information security and risk management, and also is a huge ally to Ukraine. Mrs. Past, thank you for all your support and welcome to the podcast.
I'm so glad you have been invited and to follow such a formidable lineup of your guests.
It's always an honor, and we are so pleased that all of them were happy to jump in and make this happen. So I appreciate all of their help. And for starters, we couldn't let this topic alone. So you recently had Ukrainian flag hairdo. So could you tell us a little bit of backstory behind that?
Sure. So I did indeed. Half of my hair was blue and the other half was yellow in March and April this year, and then in fading shades until I recolored it all in pink, because that's the only way you get rid of yellow in your hair, for those who needed to know. So February, early in the year, was already anyone in national security, in InfoSec or cybersecurity, was watching things closely and paying a lot of attention to their job. And especially given how open the Americans had been with their national security intelligence. So we knew there was going to be something against Ukraine or targeting Ukraine, and we knew that we rather feared that it might be something quite major. But everyone, of course, had hoped that it's not full-on terrorist kinetic warfare, whatever you want to call it. Which also then meant that many of us, myself and my team at the Ministry of Interior's IT and Development Center included, were already quite sort of anxiously watching our job on the operation security side of things, and then a war starts. And when that happens, you feel incredibly insufficient. At least I did. You feel like whatever you do, whether it's in scaling up and helping the police scale up their systems so that Ukrainian refugees can be welcome to Estonia with the least amount of hassle for them. Fleeing your home is hassle enough in our book. Or whether it's early on by hand doing a lot of the defensing measures and the monitoring measures, you feel like you should be doing more. And I think one of the things where Estonians really felt like they should be doing more is in donating. And that was one of the things that we wanted to make sure we're doing more. So everyone, myself included, was donating money to the Estonian Refugee Council, to the various Ukrainian NGOs and international NGOs. I don't have an iron and an ironing board because a Ukrainian family was specifically looking for those as they arrived in Tallinn. And one of the things, and then you're looking for creative ways to fundraise and creative ways to make that effective, whether it's retrofitting ambulances, as my friends in Estonia have done, or other ways. And I had said, listen to my team, if at least 50 euros are donated, I'll dye my hair pink, because that felt like an extra little thing I can do. And it needs to be from at least 10 different people. I didn't have 10 people in the office that day, so I had told other managers that, I'm looking for at least 10 people to donate at least 50 euros in total, and I'll dye my hair pink. So that, again, we're doing a little bit extra, raising funds when they're needed. And predictably, a colleague said, hey, that should be blue and yellow. I said, fine, but that's on a whole different price list.
Yep.
That's a whole different price list. He goes, how much? And foolishly, I didn't realize that I could have named any sum at that point. I said, well, no, I guess 200, because by the next evening, a total of about 2,000 euros had been donated by people whom I provoked to donate. So I had to make sure that my hairdresser knew what was in stock. Called her and said, listen, we're doing a Ukrainian flag now. So that was another little thing I found to do when you're doing as much as you can, but you still feel insufficient. As I think humanly you must in the face of war in Europe in 21st century, if you're not feeling enraged and insufficient, then something's wrong with you.
You didn't learn history, I guess, in that case.
You've been fortunate. Unlike, many of us, even in this conversation, you've been fortunate in ways that Estonia and Ukraine have not been, and, most other nations in this corner of the world.
Yeah, that's understandable. Also understandable you're kind of underpricing the thing, because that was before our volunteers bought satellites and Bayraktars on crowdfunds. So totally understandable. You briefly mentioned what you do as the National Cyber Director of Estonia. So could you tell us a little bit more on what you're focusing on right now? We're almost a year in war at this point. So just curious what your primary focus area is.
Everything, I guess, and it's my first job, so the job that I cannot delegate, up, down, or horizontally, is ensuring strategic coherence in cybersecurity, both in the governmental, but then also wider in the national view in Estonia, and that, especially in the face of a war in Ukraine, that involves a whole lot of activities that are either risk and threat driven or risk and threat management driven. So, and I think that's the way to go. Risk and threat driven decision making is how we need to be resourcing. And when there's a war in the neighborhood, perpetrated by a terrorist state that's been known to be opportunistic, reactive, and potentially destructive in cyberspace, then you don't know what that looks like, because you don't know what the threat is like, and then you must focus on sort of preparedness and resilience and monitoring. So my job really is to make sure that what Estonia does in cybersecurity, whether that's information security standards or whether that's national policy, makes sense comprehensively, that it comes together at the set. And of course, my team doesn't do it alone, and we couldn't do it alone, but it's rather a very sort of collaborative job. It's one where my team and sort of agencies under the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Communications have to provide the centrally provided security. So whether that's norms and requirements, such as information security standards, or whether it's monitoring of the .de domain, which our CERT does. And then we also have to set a clear understanding of the responsibility on information system owners and operators. And that's sort of data owners and data custodians. So that's sort of where we are. It's a small but incredibly agile team.
Yes, it's one of those cases where it's a relatively small nation with brave heart, and the way those Estonia and some other countries helped and reacted to this, much more decisively than many largest nations in Europe is just mind-boggling, and we definitely appreciate that. And we also understand where it comes from, because you have the same neighbor. Ukraine.
And there isn't really a choice.
I have a professional question at this point.
Sure.
How do you achieve that? What's the? Can you describe the nature of consensus that the professional community, governance bodies, state bodies, all the other stakeholders in cybersecurity of the nation have agreed to be coordinated in some way or in some form? Because that's definitely a lesson that Ukraine is eager to learn. We are still on our way to this future. I wanted to say bright, but I think that from your experience, maybe that's not so all unicorns and rainbows, and you can share the burdens and the problems that you face. But from the outside, it looks like there is a coherent posture. There is a balanced approach to matters of national cybersecurity. So, just briefly, could you describe how is it achieved?
So, with patience and a lot of good relationships.
Nice.
And it's tough. Of course, it's tough. And I don't want to go into InfoSec cliches because we've all heard them. But it's a sort of perpetual ongoing process. And it necessarily needs to be, because in Estonia is, albeit small, a reasonably decentralized sort of governance system, which means that the business of digital governance is decentralized. There's several ministries and their administrations have their own IT organizations. There's no sort of one government IT organization for all of government, but rather internal affairs has their own IT organization that I used to be the CISO of, that for homeland security runs development, runs systems, and runs security and connectivity in some cases. And the only way that you can do InfoSec, as all of you will know, is with security and data protection, in fact, a responsibility being placed where responsibility for business is placed. And whether that's through non-functional requirements, whether it's through standards, whether it's through offering or mandating particular processes, be it, data lifecycle processes or development processes or information system sort of lifecycle models. Security has to be, and risk, more importantly, risk management that then feeds into security measures, and security investment has to be where business is. And then for security to make sense, your security therefore can't be better than the business owner's understanding of their processes and products, and that anywhere in the world is very diverse. There's business owners whose understanding of their information system is that it's a monolith that has a red button. And of course, all of our friends and colleagues are more advanced than that, but theoretically there can be business owners that have these monoliths into which there's very little visibility, there's very little agility or ability to change. Everything is hard-coded, and there's no process because, it's a magical black box monolith. And then security can't be better than the understanding of those processes. So on the one hand, even in terms of governance, security lives and unfortunately dies where business lives and hopefully doesn't die. So that's the first bit. That's the bit where I think my focus even, and I've been, today is about 4 months in the job of the National Cyber Director, because I changed jobs in the middle of a pandemic and a war. So I think my number one focus for me and my team will be on that sort of responsibility and very well articulated expectation for the responsibility. And then the sense, and that's both in technology but also in policy. Now, I have a very capable team of cyber diplomats, people who deal with norms creation at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who sit at the tables at the UN, at those open-ended working groups, which, you know, they're incredibly kind, patient, and competent people to be doing that. So, and if you're responsible for diplomacy in a country, the Estonian model therefore says that then you also, where cyber and diplomacy meet, you don't drop that off, but that's also up to you. The same in national defense. So the Estonian Defense Forces have their own cyber command, as they should. And they look at both policy, especially when it comes to NATO, but also on the technical side. And then what you do centrally is what makes sense. You create the environment. And I think you create that in terms of norms, expectations, and technology. So the norms would be something like the Estonian Cybersecurity Act, which, you know, is very much aligned with the NIS directive and deals basically with what's expected of the essential service providers and who they are, what good cybersecurity for them looks like, and what, anything from audits and accountability up to requirements. Then the expectations are the software side of that. It can range from management and training top leaders to exercises where different parties get to practice what good looks like, to cybersecurity standards. As of next year, Estonia is changing over the nationally mandated cybersecurity standard. The new one that's been, the text has been published and updated for a couple of years, is very much sort of ISO 2001-like, which again sets an expectation. What risk management, process management, governance, and information security measures look like, and how often you have to, report, how often you have to review. And then the third is technical. And I think, beyond the centrally provided technical security measures, such as the Estonian Information System Authority and their CERT, the incident handlers, provide an extra layer of security, a rather clever intrusion prevention system to a large number of government clients. They provide DDoS protection on the connectivity that they provide. But it's also making sure that your centrally provided technology, whether it's connectivity or whether it's end user devices, be it computers, laptops, smartphones, tablets, or something specialized like, let's say, a law enforcement officer's kit in their car. If it's centrally provided, it has to be provided with security in mind. It's you have to make sure that on the technical level, what you centrally provide can't be offered and won't be used without security.
Was there a particular case of pushbacks that you faced? You're trying to kind of, I don't know what's the right word, enforce or just provide these measures?
Internal resistance.
Yeah.
I mean, no one's ever seen resistance to cybersecurity or information security audits, right?
At all. Everyone accepts it's.
I mean, we've.
It's a good theme for memoirs of any CISO, I guess.
I mean, as I've been lucky when I ran technical teams, I think part of that was that I've always had access to the top decision makers when I'm running technical teams, and that helps incredibly. And of course, it takes a lot of education to overcome pushback. And that education can be training and explanation and all of that. But that education also in some cases, and the UK I think is a prime example of that, can come in the sort of way of budgetary controls. If you're building information systems using government funds, then you have to do it a certain way. And of course, you have to work on the buy-in. Because if you don't work on achieving buy-in, you will have pushback. If you're with end-user devices, and Estonia we've had a central sort of information technology organization that's about 1 year old now, that will provide what's universal. So that agency will provide end-user devices, and they will provide sort of service-based data center, that sort of services, because that's so universal. Your virtual machines need to run on something. They're not running on thin air and a lot of love.
In the cloud.
and whether it's on-prem or cloud or hybrid or private or public or whatever it is, that's the sort of resources that you need. But then when you start to provide them with security in mind, and when you're centrally providing them, then the cost of them becomes very well specified, very clear. And if, as you're onboarding clients, they might have had very, very different InfoSec practices, which also means they might have had very different InfoSec expenses. And when they suddenly realize that, the standard package of what they're receiving from this centrally provided or offered rather organization, you can't opt out of security. That's factored into the service offering, and that's factored into the pricing. Of course, they'll ask if they can start paying for that next year. I mean, that's. So I think really the way to overcome pushback is creating buy-in, and creating buy-in through education. As we were looking into changing the standard that we're complying with at the Ministry of Internal Affairs. I mean, I went to enough meetings explaining why ISO 27 is a good idea and how it's aligned with the incoming Estonian information security standard, that by the end of it, I felt like I already was starting to understand it myself. Of course, there will be pushback to innovation.
Of course.
Speaking of providing security with innovation, so Ukraine keeps full speed ahead on digitalization, even despite the war, and we often put Estonia as a successful example for digital transformation. Given the experience of Estonia, what would be your suggestion for securing digital way of life for citizens? Because it's always a trade-off between convenience and features and the security we can provide, especially if it comes from the government.
So we all know how to provide an incredibly secure system that has 100% of integrity and of confidentiality.
Don't turn it on.
Exactly.
Zero,
And zero
efficiency,
availability. And you don't turn it on, but it's even better if you then encase it in concrete and pour it at the bottom of an ocean and guard it with a submarine.
And it does not ensure its security against Russian hackers anyway.
That is very true. I think that metaphor also with the cutting of Nord Stream, the disused gas
Undersea
pipeline.
cables.
It's submarine no longer is safe. I think you're right. But seriously speaking, it's exactly that balance, and that balance that then is voiced in the language of requirements. Since if the system owner or the business owner cannot voice functional and non-functional requirements, it's very hard to manage the technology or the innovation, whether it's digital identity or whether it's an app on social media. And I think for that, the requirements almost have to be technology agnostic. So the moment requirements say on the functional side, it needs to be a bright yellow user interface with a bright blue button, it's very patriotic, but it's also not very useful. And they also have to be technology agnostic in terms of what your tech stack is that you run it on. So that you can then look at what the current tech stack is, what the best in class looks like. You will never be using the best in the world of everything, but you're choosing between best in class and best in breed, so that it works together and integrates with everything you're doing. And then you have to go where your users are, and that's where I think Ukraine with the Diia app has done an incredible job. Estonia does digital service citizens really well as long as you're in a browser or on a PC. The moment these guys come into play, it's still browser native, not mobile native, or not a smart device native. And that's because our architecture was laid when smartphones were really not a thing. And we're very, very much looking at Ukraine to be able to be technology agnostic in that way, and to be able to go where users are. And then my job is to make sure that in doing that, we're not forgetting about security. We're not forgetting about confidentiality. We're not forgetting about protecting sensitive data of our citizens.
We've heard that Estonia actually plans to introduce national mobile app based on Diia. Do you know, what state that project in, and does it mean that Estonia has confidence in Diia's security? Kind of speak a little bit about that.
We're reviewing that as we speak. We're very much, and my colleague, our digital undersecretary or government CIO, Lucas Ilves, is professionally himself very, very much invested into being more on mobile platforms. And the quickest, easiest way, it could be argued, is to take Diia and run. And whether both in terms of whether both
a few people who will yeah.
I mean, in terms of
chuckle a bit while listening to this.
in terms of functionality, and we're at the point where we're evaluating our requirements and Diia to see if that match actually is realistic. And if that is, hopefully there will be news out of Estonia very soon. but there's things that Estonia prefers in terms of architecture on top of the, security requirements. In terms of security, both transparency and explainability. Encryption.
Do you plan to share like your evaluation with the Ukrainian government, or Ukrainian side, and
Please
maybe
make it
collaborate?
You know what? I know that my colleagues on the services side, and especially on the central government services side, are speaking to Ukrainians almost on a daily basis, and that's very much true with the identity and the app teams. We prefer our code base to be open source. There's conversations around these things going on.
That's why they decided to go open source. I see now. Okay, that explains a lot.
A confluence of factors, isn't it always? But Estonia prefers to be open source. Estonia prefers to be cloud ready, and Estonia prefers to do risk management throughout the life cycle of a product or a service, and Estonia prefers to bake security in. And whether that's security by design or sec DevOps or some other model, I'm not particularly bothered about, but I do feel that classic security by design might be for the masochists amongst us.
But sometimes maybe it's a bad idea. So I have a clarification maybe here.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, I do not agree that the Estonian approach to the technology stack is obsolete, because I had experience with digital services in different countries. Just comparing Ukraine, Estonia, and say Poland, Estonia is much closer to this startup-minded Diia approach than Polish digital services, for sure, because there you have to literally go run Java applets written in the 90s. At least it looks so, look and feel is very similar. But do you maybe agree or disagree that rushing forward with the usability, availability, connectivity, digital democracy, eliminating corruption through automating basic government services, and all these other points in our technocrats' agenda was maybe not a very good idea, because along the way they did not really demonstrate a lot of baking security in, as you say, right? So they
and that's why I'm saying
but they did not demonstrate it, and they were very, very reluctant to questions about how it's implemented. In the end of the day, it looks like it's not like the worst possible software product security-wise, but the count is public. There are no critical vulnerabilities. All the data leaks, so-called, are questionable, and are more of information operations than actual compromises, but openness regarding application security was how to say it, was not there.
And I
right?
think I don't think we're disagreeing. I think there are two things, and I'll address the sort of openness point first. Estonia has learned that when it comes to security, we have to be aggressively open. I spoke about the sort of very cooperation based, but we also have to be aggressively open. Mm-hmm. And we learned that, I think, first in 2007 with the DDoS attack targeting Estonian critical infrastructure as well as government institutions around the Bronze Soldier riots. A Soviet war memorial was moved to a cemetery from behind the bus stop in Tallinn city center. And we relearned that, or highlighted that, in 2017, when it turned out that the Estonian government issued ID card, the digital identity element of it, there was a cryptography implementation error in a particular crypto library in the firmware of the chip. So in something that Estonia didn't put there, that was baked into the chip. And that affected at least 1 billion, possibly 2 billion chips around the world. Chips in identity documents, but also in secure computing modules. So, and about 600,000 of those were in Estonia, including in my own ID card. And essentially we found out, fortunately, when it was a theoretical, hypothetical vulnerability. We knew that there was an issue with the math. Is effectively in generating the randomness could potentially run out of randomness in generating the private key.
Yeah, especially on small chips like that, it's very tough to get enough randomness.
Which, I mean, it's an implementation engineering error.
Here we can be less technology agnostic. I remember the story. Was it something in RSA chips, or what was it?
So it was not an RSA chip. The chip was provided by a big technology provider, but it was that the chip had 4 crypto libraries in it, and the RSA library had been implemented taking shortcuts imperfectly. Okay. As often happens with cryptography, and I'm not a techie. And by no means I'm by no means a cryptologist or a cryptographer, but as often happens, cryptography is implemented by people who don't fully understand what they're doing, and that it seems like it was a lazy implementation. In the end, we were able to shift the key generation to the elliptical curves because that happened to be on that as well. And we could remotely update the chip. And because Estonia generates the private key on the chip, that could happen. And that's so that you couldn't do man in the middle because you'd never transfer the private key. And because we had the option.
It was big news. Yeah.
Of course it was big news. It's, about half of the ID cards you've issued have a potential vulnerability, and it was a race between 2 timelines. And Estonia was almost the first one who was very, very open about it. Now we know there's at least 1 billion of those chips. We know they would have had impact on identity documents as well as pretty advanced computing kit. And I found out about a week before, and I was the chief research officer for the Information System Authority's cybersecurity branch. I found out a week before Estonia had a big press conference with the Prime Minister, the Director General of the Police, of the Information System Authority, the responsible ministers, and told the world. And what that meant was...
Did you have the working plan of mitigating this incident right at the conference?
No. We knew that it's 2 timelines. It's a timeline...
Still, you faced the challenge. You showed that you admit that it's the fact, it's the reality, and you will work on mitigating that, right?
And we needed to be aggressively open for a couple reasons. That's why aggressive openness makes sense. One is we knew that it's a race between timelines of us having a fix and there being a
practical attack. Yeah,
exactly. There being an exploit of the vulnerability. We knew that the vulnerability likely doesn't scale. So even if you compromise a single key pair at a time. But what if it's, a well-known person's key pair? And if you've demonstrated a compromise of one, you've demonstrated the compromisability. And that would trigger all sorts of things. So we knew that when we had a fix, people would need to take it seriously and would need to especially doctors and people who in their jobs need to have the digital identity. So we knew that whenever we had a fix, and hopefully had the fix before the exploit, people would need to take it seriously and update it. And secondly, as we had already found out in 2007, if you speak openly, you can't be held hostage to that information. So, and that's a scenario that's never been a realistic threat to us. But, I mean, basically we all know in our everyday relationships, we all make mistakes, we all mess up. And if you're the person to say first, hey, I messed up and I have a plan to how to have a plan, then it's no longer hanging over your head. And thirdly, in current day and age, vulnerabilities will happen. It's inevitable. If you don't,
Exactly.
if you're not openly communicating about risks in a digital service or in a digital environment, then you're either lying or you're a criminal or you're lying to a criminal degree. Or you're just really bad at
Just
what you're doing.
incompetent. Yeah.
Criminally incompetent, possibly.
So were those cards already issued by the time you found out, or was it before, so you had a chance to actually update them?
It was 600,000 cards that were in people's wallets.
Oh, wow. And
But
how
they
do you
could
even...
update them themselves, the Diia card readers, right? That you
Exactly.
along with the
Yeah.
with the IDs. Okay.
Oh, I see.
And that's because we had both technically and legally allowed for a remote update option. So it was a sort of just several things that we put in place just in case. The remote updating being one of them. Then the fact that the producer put more than one crypto library in the firmware. So those all things coming together helped us.
So slowly, as people use the cards, they would get updated over time.
They would need to specifically update it, so it doesn't do it itself, and not everyone uses the card-based digital identity. I prefer to use mobile ID, which is a secure chip that's tied to my ID card. There's also other alternatives, so it really depends on people's preference.
Got it.
But so that's to Vlad's point. Estonia has learned that we need to be aggressively open, because otherwise, that's one of the possible readers. That's the more elegant one. Yeah.
That's one I have.
I have a very similar one somewhere behind me here, and this laptop has a card reader built in.
That's an incredible story of recovering from problems like that, because hardware updates are always the trickiest to do, and I was even surprised you had some kind of move forward plan versus just accept and work around that.
And I mean, to be honest, you do know what the main factor in good technical cooperation is? Beer. Main factor is beer. This is because this finding was from a group of researchers in the Czech Republic, academics, and they'd found it, and because they had a beer or two with the Estonians working, the very, very clever security engineers working on the Estonian digital identity, they knew to even just first very generally approach them and ask if work is keeping them busy, just to even gauge whether we knew, and we didn't. So it's also the academics doing, and the Czech academics doing the responsible thing in terms of disclosure was the key. It was the kickoff and the key.
Probably not the most efficient channel of sharing information, but seems like one of the most efficient.
Trust helps beer, apparently. I'm
Yeah.
not
So very important.
myself. But
No, absolutely. We're social
some
beings.
for the record,
Exactly.
tea.
Well, I mean, for your timeline and time zone, I mean, it would be permissible. I have to stick with coffee anyway because it's not even 9 a.m. So unless we win, that's the only time I'll drink at 9 a.m. So
If you
speaking
don't
of
mind,
attacks,
that's not tea.
like I said, you're in that time zone that permits. So debates and speculations about the role of cyber in the war, cyber attacks by Russia, right, on Ukraine and allies during the war keep going. And what's your opinion about it? Is it expected level of cyber attacks, or what are the reasons that we don't see, another NotPetya or like completely internet blackouts or stuff like that, as people speculated before the war, in case when it starts? And do you think how well coordinated do you think Russia's actions were in this regard?
Every time someone says we're not seeing things, you have to ask, is it that we're not seeing because they're not there? Is it that we're not seeing because we're so good at defending, or are we flying blind?
That was the next question.
Most probably the latter.
I think it's a combination of the three, but I don't think, if you look at the level of publicly available information, if you look at the level of what also Americans and others and corporations have put out there, it's clear that we're at least not flying completely blind. There's it's the statistics of what our intrusion prevention system, the one that's offered universally, picks up, tells me that we're not flying blind. When I talk to Ukrainians, it doesn't, that doesn't fully look that way. And I do think we're short-sighted with our own metaphors there, because people expect there to be this cyber aggression. And I don't want to call it warfare, because warfare implies a very certain level of damage in international law. But cyber aggression is not as binary as kinetic operations, and it's not as visible as kinetic operations. So it's not always immediately as destructive, but it is often designed to create annoyance. In fact, I would argue that in a war where the parties rely on signals intelligence, they will restrain their destructive cyber powers, because if you take comms down, then you can't spy on comms. So it makes no sense for the aggressor in this war to take Ukrainian communications down, because how the hell are you going to spy on Ukrainians if you take comms down? And that's not just an Ukrainian case, but that's in modern warfare, I would argue, always the case. But more importantly, I get upset when people say, we're not seeing an expected level of cyber warfare. And am I allowed to swear on your podcast?
For
Go
sure.
ahead.
Yeah.
There's a fucking war going on in Ukraine with bombs falling on civilian targets. And the fact that cyber doesn't create as much of that level of destruction in terms of civilian infrastructure and civilian life doesn't mean that there's no cyber aggression. I mean, there's, early on already the VS attack, for example.
Yeah.
The fact that the immediate impact of cyber operations isn't as destructive as bombings, hospitals.
Now that's explainable by cumulative strategic effect of any cyber operations. You do not. NotPetya was destructive because it went out of hands.
Yeah.
It wasn't intended to do so much.
And it
damage,
also
right?
it was the only thing that happened, and there was no kinetic
Yeah, exactly.
action alongside.
So I think just currently, unfortunately, our threshold for destructive and war is really high because there's a really destructive war going on. A war that's had in the last, since February 24th, has had incredibly destructive effects on lives of people, governance of parts of Ukraine, and civilian infrastructure in parts of Ukraine. So I think it's short-sighted and populist to say that there isn't cyber or there isn't enough cyber. It's just that it's not as terrible as the war. And it is true also, I mean, when we look back, there might be probably some sort of restraint. When you look at the power grid attacks against Ukrainian power grid over Christmas 2015 and 16, there probably was some restraint in that. There was an element of showing off what you can do, but not doing it everywhere. And that's, now I'm on very thin ice of telling people about things that they likely know more about than I do. But of course there's been waves of DDoS attacks going across Europe, targeting particularly at times transport, for example, or government websites. They've not been to the detriment of human lives.
What about like this stealing information and spying, and specifically in preparation to the war? Because it's kind of less visible, cyber operations, right? But they might have been like very impactful in terms of, like what the Russians do in occupied territories, right, and so on. And at the same time, I guess visibility of Western companies, right, and different Ukrainian aliases before the invasion were like less, right? So maybe like there was like actually a huge effect in those kind of operations.
There was definitely some, and this is based on things that Microsoft in particular, and then the U.S. Government agencies and the U.S. intelligence community have said, there clearly was laying tracks for the war. And whether it was information gathering, whether, we know that also that in addition to information gathering, that the politically motivated attacker prefers to lay low, unlike the criminally minded attacker who wants to grab, run, and monetize. The politically motivated attacker can, fly under the radar for months, sometimes for years. Again, of the publicly dissected events, the US 2016 elections that, have been attributed to Russia with varying levels of confidence by Americans themselves. And I think that where the disagreement is whether the hack of the presidential campaigns of 2016 changed the election results or not. The question isn't whether there was a hack. The question isn't whether it was Russian. And there's also general agreement that those systems had been corrupted for months and probably over a year. So do all the system owners that have been compromised know that they've been compromised? Probably not. No, with a high degree of confidence, probably not. Might the attacker be laying low and slowly gaining access and credentials and visibility and sending information home slowly? It's not unlikely.
What kind of advice, if you have any, would you give to Ukraine in terms of protecting against against all these threats in terms of securing communications? To give a little bit more context, right? There are cases of Russia spying on Telegram in particular, And I don't know how popular it is in Estonia. It is unfortunately quite popular in Ukraine. And the little story is I actually used, Vlad over here once shared a way to use Little Snitch, a macOS firewall to kind of block all Russian IPs, just in case. And when I did that, I realized that my Telegram calls don't work anymore when I call someone in Ukraine, and it hangs on key exchange procedure if I block all the Russian IPs. So that was interesting. So I wonder what's your position on Telegram, and also are there any other advices you would give to to change to people, what they should change in their day-to-day lives to be more protected?
I mean, it's tough because, first of all, Ukrainians are tough. So, and second of all, because there's no one fix. And we all know that. We all wish there was one fix, because then we could be doing something else in our lives, running small cafes and raising sheep, preferably. But I think it's a combination of two things. Whatever it is that you need to do for business continuity, particularly in terms of connectivity, whether an imperfect satellite to back up an imperfect fiber optic cable is a lot better in terms of continuity of connectivity than either of those separately. More than one way to contact people in their own personal communications. And secondly, the best cryptography you can afford.
And it's not Telegram.
Yeah, and that is not Telegram. Objectively.
There's messaging platforms that generally that have not been publicly corrupted yet, at least, or compromised. And you almost have to assume that the pipes in which your communications flow, so whether it's satellite, whether it's fiber optic, or whether it's something else, can be compromised, especially in an uncertain security situation. And then cryptography and having the best end-to-end encryption you can afford, and maybe breaking up your communications so that one channel doesn't have all the essential information, and maybe chunking it up and sending it separately is a way to also be better. But all of you know so much better than I do what the best consumer level end-to-end encrypted, reasonably reliable messaging platform that still has decent availability would be in Ukraine. I mean, Vlad tells us it's not Telegram.
Oh, it's not, but Telegram is fast, It's a problem. It's a problem. Even WhatsApp is not that fast, so unfortunately a lot of people
pretty fast. There are a lot of convenient features. I agree. I would rather, I guess it's fine to use it as a social network, like we all do for, assume it as Facebook public posts. But when it comes to what concerns me,
becomes a leg in a supply chain attack. When you start regretting you used it as a public social network, So it's too muddy of a topic to figure out within the time we're given.
Yeah. And what concerns me the most is though when either military uses it or people on occupied territories, and we've seen cases where that's a problem.
And that means that's something that it's really hard to fix as an individual, but if your national defense structures and actors start to use shadow IT, whether it's a messaging app, or whether it's a social network group, or whether it's personal email addresses, that means that the usability of what you're providing does not fulfill their needs. No, these are people who know what right what's right. No, a national
How to do the
security
job
or
done.
and you need to educate your soldiers. And it's tough because you also need to educate them in kinetic operations, and that's your first priority. But and it might be that in a war or in a conflict or in a crisis, you say that no, questionable security but reasonable availability is better than no availability but great security. But the more you at least manage expectations and educate, the better. And the more you think about how to have access to official secure channels when the physical security of a place is compromised, then that also prevents some of the shadow IT.
Also, I think one of the factors in it is there is so much going on right now that you cannot fix everything, and probably I hope, or if it becomes the biggest problem, right, they will address it. Otherwise, like the fact that we have some of these cases, like it's said, just like with a lot of other said things, but they need to do ruthless prioritization. So I guess that explains it. In terms of the defenses, since we kind of switched to this topic, and also before that, I want to kind of just do a disclaimer. So we are 1 hour mark here. We do want to be mindful of your time. So please let us know if you need to run. If you do have a few spare minutes, though, we still have a few questions that ideally we would want to cover.
I'm good with that. I have the advantage of this being the evening for me, so I've taken my goddaughter to see a very Estonian Santa already. I'm fine.
Yep, I was gonna say we give you permission to switch from tea to something stronger in the meantime.
Yeah, put
so
more.
With more. Do you think does current level of collaboration in data sharing between Ukraine, Estonia, NATO, and other allies sufficient at this moment, or still needs to be improved?
So it depends on what we mean by information sharing, because there's definitely a part of a political culture that fetishizes information sharing and says, no, we need to share information and experience, and we need to share lessons learned and experience sharing, which is great. But what does that mean? And we're all mature enough, Estonia and its allies and Ukraine, to look into that. And I think for any information sharing to be valuable, it needs, first of all, to be actionable. Which means either it's as specific as possible or as practical as possible. If mitigating a certain attack has worked for someone, then information sharing of we've seen attacks is not really useful, but saying we action this way against it. And secondly, it needs to be time specific or time sensitive. So in terms of technical, it needs to be real time or close to real time. And for that, a lot of our existing information sharing, and that's true within Western alliances as well, information sharing mechanisms are a little slow in a world where, as we saw already with Petya, not Petya was mentioned, the WannaCry, as businesses wake up, if they don't mitigate before their workers turn on computers, it's too late. So really, the defenders need to know to make sure that computers are not turned on in such a scenario, which then means that whether it's a security operations center, your security operations center, often that's the certs, or something else, then that makes sense. And I'm a big fan of the American ISAC model, Information Sharing and Analysis Center, And the Americans tend to do it in a sectorial way. So there's a space ISAC, an elections ISAC, an energy ISAC, and they tend to be almost membership organization type sort of force multipliers. And whether we call it an ISAC or whether we call it something else, I think that focus on actionability and being as close to real time, as possible is really key. And then, of course, even when that happens, you need to triage. You need to have a good understanding of what your own vulnerabilities are, because otherwise you'll drown on the information. Lack of information is not our problem. Lack of trustworthy, actionable, timely, and triaged or prioritized information is what we need to strive for.
Right. I guess these kind of bonds are a little bit more difficult to build between countries versus companies or individuals. So I guess that also could play a role. It's more of intelligence.
We've agreed as international community to norms, and it's taken in some cases half a century. We've agreed on, and it's not perfect. And I know you want to talk about deterrence and why that's important. But if I happily will. But if it was easy, we would have done it already, of course. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't strive for it.
Maybe a quick follow-up to information sharing, right? Like, do you think the role of private companies, right, supporting here is actually then big, right? Because as you mentioned, right, it's important to triage and prioritize information to share, and private companies probably have more resources, right? Like different industry security researchers can help here. So is it a vector to involve more, or yeah?
I would maybe add up to this that private companies most probably have less regulations and fewer limitations to exchange information.
Well, but also, and I think it's all hands, because in this digital world that we live in, the major international technology corporations impact lives more than almost any government in terms of just our everyday digital way of life. So it needs to be all hands, and it's not an either or, it's not one or the other. It's governments, even if they get it right, even if they have a good virtual SOC type of a thing that triages already and does all of that in place, see their domain. Now, if you're a major international cloud-based service provider, you see a very different picture simply because you see globally, but in a particular sector. And I think, we need both. And in that, for a policy person, I guess I'm extraordinarily impatient in that, what we do needs to have an actual added value. It needs to make us better at what we do.
Some countries, such as Australia, Japan, recently started to allow offensive and proactive cyber operations. We're slowly switching to cyber deterrences. We decided we want to talk about it. What are your thoughts on this? And do you think Estonia or other EU countries follow this approach and kind of normalize this?
So countries are quite varied in how sort of deeply they describe what they do. And also in terms of what they have created norms for. There's a fair amount of sort of language that's being played with, proactive, reactive, offensive, defensive measures. Where does a honeypot land in that game? Is a honeypot a defensive measure unless you're on the offense, in which case it becomes an active measure against you? So there's a fair amount of linguistics, but I think that discussion really lays ground for the central question in our sort of deterrence posture, which is deterrence is built on mutually ensured credible destruction, and then the belief that if both sides know that, then they will exercise restraint. So that's how deterrence works currently. And in terms of the diplomatic measures, it then also, deterrence push often assumes that sanctions and naming and shaming work on those who are capable of name and shame, or who are capable of shame. And I don't think the current Russian Federation is capable of shame. So that means that in a way we're, as a rules-based international community, we're a little stuck. On the one hand, if we strike first, it's like kids on a playground. Really, it's like bullies on a playground. The key to strikes first becomes the bully. And we've agreed that, we're better than that. But what if the bully doesn't believe in deterrence, or isn't deterred unless they are struck first? But then if you strike first, then you become the bully. And that's the same with our current deterrence posture, where if offensive measures were deployed first disproportionately, then they might deter, but then also we've compromised the value set for which we stand, and then standing for it, like the values we stand for become meaningless, and then what's the point of it all anyway? I mean, why any of this matters to me personally. Amongst other things, 3 out of my 4 grandparents were child refugees in the Second World War, so this is bloody personal. Is that, how do we make sure that what makes us, in terms of democratic rule of law based nations and communities of democratic rule of law based nations, us, that we can't lose that? So, and we've agreed that proportionate response in self-defense is what it is. And if we overstep that boundary, then are we any better than anyone else? So that's sort of where the issue is. But we also understand, I think, increasingly the royal we of the rules-based Western nations, that, believing that you might strike reactively is not necessarily credible and effective deterrence against a thug from St. Petersburg.
And I think one country had pretty vast experience in like what you're talking, this line between, striking first out of necessity and ethics is Israel, because they did both. They did this both in conventional war and also cyber operations, and usually they do it when the chances, when all the alternatives are so skim for them to succeed that they have to do it, and that's when they make the decision. So maybe this is also the guidelines that we could use here.
And the granularity of doctrine varies a lot, I think, necessarily reflecting just political cultures. So there's capabilities exist amongst many of us, many of the Western nations. But you still have to weigh that you're not disproportionate. And it might be true that, a devastating cyber attack on the enemies, on your enemies, on your attackers' infrastructure is also makes more sense in our mindset, because I could see theoretically, I could easily build a case where if we disable the enemy's offensive systems, and if we disable their critical infrastructure, then the devastating effect on lives is less. And I mean, to save lives, and then this, that's the objective, to save civilian lives.
Do you think information operations and propaganda also kind of related to this? Should we think about them, or is this like completely separate, and state should have nothing to do with it?
I think we have to look at them in connection to each other, but whether you manage them together separately or in a coordinated way can be different. I mean, listen, we know that Russian Federation has the stated national interest of dominance, and then in fulfilling that is quite opportunistic and reactive. It's almost like a child throwing a spaghetti at the wall. That's how you teach children how to know that spaghetti is done. If you throw it at the wall and it sticks, it's done. So we know that there's throwing spaghetti at the wall, or if you'd rather have a different metaphor, going for the lowest hanging fruit. And the fruit can be in cyber attacks, so on information security. But often the lower hanging fruit is that in the sort of legitimacy of government, creating doubt and confusion. And in this quite segmented information space, and particularly when you look at the United States, but then also across Europe, we have our different language spaces that makes us more segmented. If you have that segmented space where doubt and confusion already exists, then often it's cheaper for the attacker to create doubt and confusion. You don't need to actually compromise the system for people to believe that governance itself has been compromised. And if it's cheaper, they'll go for it, which then means that in terms of comprehensive defense and comprehensive risk management, you have to look at these different elements together or in connection. But whether you do it under one crisis authority or whether you do it separately, there's no brilliant solution, but you have to do it.
Makes sense. Probably the last thing that we want to cover, unless guys have something else. So I'm really interested to learn about locked shields, right? So you ran external relations and the Stratcom game in the world's largest international technical network defense exercise called Locked Shields. Could you tell us about it, and what training or skills would you recommend to Ukrainian cyber defenders as well?
So Estonians haven't won for a few years, so I'll have to be careful in what advice I give. So yes, you're right. It's an international technical exercise with these policy and communication elements run by the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence, an international military organization based here in Tallinn. And it looks like a technical exercise, but what we've found and what I've seen over and over again in being, I was part of that exercise for 3 or 4 years and quite deeply on the organizing and white team side, is that the teams that come to these exercises are competent enough. Even if it's cadets or conscripts, they generally understand, how to run a vulnerability scan. They generally understand. If you don't know what PowerShell is, then you shouldn't be part of a technical exercise team on the Q team side. I wouldn't necessarily know how to do that, but that's why I'm not that training audience. But where teams fail or win in such exercise is cooperation and prioritization. The whole point of it is for the exercise to be quite intense. It's several days of intensive live fire action. And you get access to a network that you don't fully understand necessarily, and you don't fully even see necessarily.
Right.
So you know that there's things you don't know, and you know that there's more attacks than you can probably defend against. And just like in a real life information security scenario, the question then becomes, now how do we know what we know and understand what we don't know? And how do we prioritize, and how do we know what all of our folks are doing? So that's the effective teams. The effective teams are the ones that run with that in mind. Because there's no single person or even a single team. You might be the best security analysts in the business, and some of them have been parts of Locked Shields. But if the rest of your team doesn't know what you're doing, you're not going to last for very long.
That's probably one of the most advanced kind of ways to train and prepare, for real world action. Yeah.
Oh, and going back to what Vlad said before, don't lie. Make sure that saying, give me half an hour to figure it out and we'll get back to you, rather than saying, oh, this is definitely this way, or this definitely is not this way. It's just in that exercise, just in a real life scenario, don't lie.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for sharing that, and we do hope that Estonia maybe will win in the next Locked Shields competition.
Well, we know that Ukraine will win the war, and that matters much more.
Thank you so much, and I just also wanted to say that as long as people get all the experience and prepare, that it doesn't really matter who wins, as long as there is some value provided to everyone. In this case, that's true, because I don't like this approach of we need to give everyone a little bit of rewards, but in this case, I think everyone does get the reward. Basically the last question that we usually ask is what would be your advice or just words to Ukrainian audience? I think you kind of already mentioned that you want us to win, and thank you for that. But
and I struggle with no one wins a war, because when a war starts, everyone's already lost. But I know that Ukraine will prevail. There's no doubt in that, and whether it's in making sure that we protect our own networks, or whether it's in cooperation with Ukraine, and it's so important that we're cooperating with the Ukrainians. It's two-sided, and it's a two-sided cooperation of equals. I know that Ukraine will prevail.
Ukraine doesn't really have alternatives. It's either Ukraine wins and prevails, or there is no Ukraine. So that's the only choice. That's the only choice we've got. I want to thank you so much for everything that you shared, and I think it's been super insightful and just incredible. Thank you for all the work you do, and a lot of other people I know at Estonia also do. We hope for the best. Let's continue cooperation, and we also wish you best of luck in your future work, and hope that things will over time will improve for everyone. And thank you so much for the conversation. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to this podcast, and also support Ukraine in any way you can. We truly appreciate every bit of support, big and small, because it all adds up. Thank you so much, and till next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.